Hello, and welcome to Starbound. My name is I Am Duck, and I'll be your narrator. If you enjoy human-created HFY stories and want to support us, we're on Patreon now. You'll also get access to exclusive stories you won't hear anywhere else. Link is in the description. Now let's get into it. The cleanser had taken 4 solar cycles to design. Bayerink had spent most of them 3 decks below the observation platform, in a laboratory assigned to him alone that he had never once opened to a colleague. Macrophage science operated through competition, not cooperation. Competing teams, competing resources, competing models, each working in a proprietary silence toward the same objective with no knowledge of the other's progress. The best solution rose through that pressure the way anything pure rose, by surviving what the inferior versions could not. Bayerink's team had worked through 847 failed iterations before the 848th held. He was not certain how many iterations the other teams had managed before he had been summoned to present his results to the Command Assembly, and the others had been dissolved. It did not matter. His had held. He stood on the observation deck of Purity's Gaze and watched the telemetry feed from the atmospheric deployment drones. The ship hung in high orbit, close enough for detailed surface observation and far enough that the target world filled the forward viewports in a broad sweep of blue and white, wrapped in the active, poorly managed cloud cover that Bayerink had come to associate with an undisciplined biosphere. Dozens of drones moved through the upper atmosphere below him, releasing the cleanser in quantities that were, by any honest measure, generous. Each drone seeded monitoring nanobots alongside the cleanser, built to descend with the agent and report concentration data from the lower atmosphere for as long as their charge held. Bayerink had not needed to be generous. He had simply been thorough. The macrophage had not always been what they were now. Bayerink knew the history, though it was not the kind one lingered over. Thousands of solar cycles ago, their world had carried the same biological noise as the one below. Competition, entropy, the constant contamination of an unmanaged living system. They had corrected that. First the pathogens, then the vectors, then the broader ecology. Quietly and methodically redesigned until their homeworld ran with the efficiency of a system liberated from its own worst instincts. Bayerink had grown up on that world. He had never been ill. The humans had not done any of this. That was visible even from orbit. A world of uncontrolled biological sprawl, teeming with contaminants and biological hazards that his own kind had long since eliminated. They had the same starting conditions. They had simply never done the work. The cleanser was not punishment. It was correction. Commander Orelin came to stand beside him at the viewport. The commander was tall even by macrophage standards, the joint lines at his neck and the backs of his hands tracing faint, dark seams against pale, ivory skin, carrying the composed, almost architectural quality that their kind held through bearing rather than effort. His wide, flat, opaque eyes were on the world below. His expression communicated nothing. Elegant, Orelin said. Bayerink considered the word. Elegant was not inaccurate. The cleanser had been designed with a fidelity that bordered on artistry. Binding sites, receptor targets, zero cross-reactivity with any other terrestrial organism. The humans would be removed. The world below would continue intact, its biosphere preserved in full, uncontaminated and entirely unaware of what had been done on its behalf. There was satisfaction in that. A clean result was its own form of honor. Elegant, Bayerink agreed. Among other things. 14 minutes into the deployment, the nanobot telemetry confirmed concentrations across all 43 target zones were reaching modeled thresholds at ground level. The agent was spreading as designed. He noted this with the satisfaction of a craftsman whose work had been executed correctly, and began preparing the Cycle 20 projection updates. Aurelin stayed long enough to review the initial figures, pronounced himself satisfied, and left for other business. Bayerink barely registered his departure. He was already running the projections. Several cycles passed. Bayerink sat in the analytics laboratory and stared at numbers that did not match the other indices. Infection had been confirmed across all target zones within the first cycle, spreading on every projected vector. The nanobots had dissolved on schedule, as designed, leaving no recoverable trace. From that point, his data came entirely from the humans themselves. The mortality data was substantial. Tens of millions of confirmed infections across the target world's major population zones. Fatality rates consistent with the cleanser design parameters. Societal disruption measures in every indice his surveillance systems could capture from the human comms. By any previous framework for civilizational fragility, the human world should have been fracturing along every available seam. His model had predicted it clearly. Organized governance failing by Cycle 15, resource distribution collapsing by Cycle 20, the remaining population too fragmented and depleted to mount any meaningful coordination. Total societal dissolution within 80 cycles. The mortality curve was flattening. Not dramatically, not at a rate that contradicted the underlying infection data, faster than his models had accounted for. Measurably, undeniably, persistently faster. Bayerink sorted the intercepted human communications by frequency and source. The same designations repeated across hundreds of separate transmissions. WHO, CDC, something called the Pandemic Response Initiative Global. He cross-referenced them, international governance bodies, medical coordination networks, structures that his pre-deployment analysis had categorized as too politically fractious to function under genuine systemic pressure. They appeared to be functioning. He pulled visual intercepts, purpose-built quarantine infrastructure, erected in what his timeline indicated was a matter of rotations. Mass production of personal protective equipment distributed through supply chains that should, by Cycle 10, have collapsed entirely, and threaded through all of it an open research network. Human scientists sharing findings publicly. In real time across national and institutional boundaries, competitive organizations pooling their work without apparent restriction or negotiation. Macrophage science did not operate this way. It never had. The concept was not merely alien to him, it was by any logic he had been trained to apply counterproductive. Threaded beneath all of it was something his surveillance architecture had no category for. A massive surge in distributed computing traffic originating from what his systems classified as civilian machines. Millions of them, globally, with no institutional affiliation and no command node, spontaneously pooling idle processing capacity toward the same biological problem from millions of separate sources. Simultaneously, Bayerink logged it, filed it, and moved on. A name surfaced repeatedly in the coordination traffic. Florian Nachtigall. Identified as leading the PRIG, perhaps a coordination function, not a scientific one. Bayerink noted it, filed it, and moved on. Aurelin appeared in the laboratory doorway on a routine check. Bayerink turned the updated projections to face him without preamble. "Your model is wrong," Aurelin said. "The model is accurate. The variable is not behaving as projected." "Then your assessment of the variable was wrong." "Possibly," Bayerink said. "I am examining that probability. Aurelin studied the global coordination map on the secondary display, the lines of resource movement, the expanding communication nodes, the research distribution network spreading with accelerating urgency across a world that was supposed to be dying. His wide eyes moved across the display without expression. "Find the error in your projections before the next command briefing," Aurelin said. Then he left. Bayerink turned back to the display. The humans were dying in large numbers. The cleanser was working. None of that was in question, and yet the coordination map refused to resolve into the pattern his models had predicted. Not in the deaths, not in the spread, in the response, in the speed of it, the scale of it, the refusal of the governance infrastructure to fracture the ways models projected. The coordination map was not the signature of a civilization in collapse. It bore the signature of a civilization that had done this before, at least once, that had, somewhere in its long and apparently costly history, built the institutional infrastructure for just this type of crisis, and remembered, collectively and without hesitation, how to use it. His models had not accounted for that. He was not yet certain how. The formal briefing Bayerink had requested took place 12 cycles after deployment of the cleanser, and the ship's main assembly room with every senior officer present. 6 of them, all tall, all still, all carrying the composed pale ivory patience that the macrophage brought to every occasion. They arranged themselves around the display table and waited. Bayerink had brought 3 data models. He had needed only one. But he had learnt, over a long career, that presenting 3 gave the assembly something to argue with. Show them one thing, they argued with your conclusions. Show them 3, they argued with each other. It was usually more productive. The first model was the projected mortality curve. 4 solar cycles of iteration validated against every historical dataset in the archive, built with conservative margins at every interval. The second was the actual curve as of that morning. He placed them side by side and said nothing. The deviation was not subtle. "The weapon is functioning," he said. "Infection rates match projections. Mortality rates do not. The discrepancy has widened at every measurement interval since cycle 6. "The weapon is functioning," Aurelin said. "Then the model is wrong." "The model is accurate. The response is the variable." He moved to the third model. What followed required careful explanation, and Bayerink gave it without editorializing. The Open Human Research Network, the international medical bodies, the quarantine infrastructure assembled in rotations, the public sharing of data across institutional and national boundaries. He had traced the correlation between the network's expansion and the widening mortality deviation. The humans were working against the cleanser cooperatively, at a speed his models had not indicated was possible because he had not considered cooperation a meaningful variable. The assembly absorbed this in the way the macrophage absorbed everything unexpected, with the stillness of people who were recategorizing rather than reacting. Bayerink had always found this quality useful in scientific environments. He was finding it considerably less useful now. "They are sharing their research," said one of the officers. "Openly, with competitions." "Yes." "Without negotiation, without propriety protections, as far as the data indicates." The officer looked at Bayerink as though he had described something physically improbable. Bayerink understood the reaction. It had been his own when he had first confirmed it. Macrophage science advanced through rivalry, through the friction of competing interests, the pressure of exclusivity, the quality that emerged only when inferior alternatives had been eliminated. Open sharing was not merely inefficient, it was, by every framework Bayerink had ever been trained to apply, the mechanism by which you lost. He was beginning to suspect that the frameworks had gaps in them, and yet he could not articulate them. The logic was internally consistent. Competition eliminated inferior solutions. The field advanced. The archive bore it out across centuries. What the archive did not contain was a single instance of open collaboration deployed against an existential threat, because the macrophage had never needed one. The closest analogy to macrophage history was the early period before the codification of competitive science costs, when knowledge had moved more freely between researchers. That era was regarded as primitive. The codification of competition had accelerated their scientific progress, or so the dominant interpretation held. Bayerink found himself wondering, for the first time, whether that interpretation had ever been tested against a crisis that demanded something other than competition. Orrelin's dismissal was brief. The model was flawed. Bayerink was to find the error and correct it before his next report. The briefing adjourned. There was no error. He would search for it anyway. He returned to his laboratory and spent the next 4 cycles building new models and discarding them. The first cycle, he revised his assumptions about human governance fragility, calibrating the collapse threshold against every comparable civilization in the archive. The second, he ran the revised projections and found they still diverged from observed data in ways he could not account for. The third and fourth cycles, he stopped building models and simply watched the incoming feeds. He had nothing to build toward. The open research network was expanding, new nodes connecting across boundaries he had categorized as impermeable. Rival institutions, competing national programs, research groups whose pre-deployment intelligence had listed as actively hostile to one another's work. They were sharing everything. Not selectively, not in controlled exchanges, fully and in real time. Bayerink had no framework for what he was observing. He noted that he was not attempting to build one, and filed that observation alongside the others. The surface landing probe had returned from its collection run 40 hours prior, and he had let the sample rest in secondary containment while he worked on the models. He turned to it now. The probe had spent 6 hours on the target world's surface, collecting atmospheric and surface particulate data from a high-density active transmission zone. Bayerink had wanted a clean sample from the infection front to verify his mutation rate calculations. He loaded the sample. The mutation rates were not what his models had projected. He ran the sequence again. Identical results. A third time, with a different analysis protocol. A fourth, against the original cleanser genomic baseline. 5 passes in total, conducted with the mechanical thoroughness that scientific training demanded when results made no sense. The same result, every time. Bayerink had spent 4 solar cycles designing the cleanser to target a single species with absolute specificity. The binding mechanisms were locked to receptor configurations unique to human biology. He had modeled the weapon against 17 potential mutation pathways and found that none of them could compromise its human-specific targeting without also compromising its viability. The weapon would drift, all biological agents did, but not in any direction that mattered. That analysis had been conducted in a sterile laboratory against a dataset that had never included Earth's biosphere as an active variable. He had modeled the humans, he had not modeled their world. That was his error. The distinction mattered. Earth's biosphere had not yet received the cleanser as a foreign agent in a stable environment. The biosphere was the stimulus. It applied the same relentless selection pressure to the cleanser that had applied to everything that moved through it. The cleanser had entered a system that had been stress-testing biological agents without pause, and Earth's biosphere had done what it always did. It had adapted the cleanser, made it something else. Bayerink studied the new mutation profiles for a long time. None of his 17 modeled pathways, not close to any of them. Something that had emerged from the intersection of his weapon and a biosphere unlike anything in his reference data, a result that his sterile laboratory had been constitutionally incapable of predicting because the variable that produced it had never existed in his people's experience. The new configurations were stable, not drift, selection. Something in Earth's biosphere tested his weapon and these variants had survived, which meant each of them had found something to bind to. Bayerink was still working through the binding profiles when the alarm cut through the laboratory. A register he had never heard aboard her in the 6 solar cycles of his posting. Priority 1. Medical. Containment. Breach. Bayerink was already moving. The medical bay was still warm when Bayerink arrived. The technician from the probe recovery team had been dead for perhaps 40 minutes, though the medic was still attempting to determine the cause with the methodical bewilderment that Bayerink recognized as the medical equivalent of staring at numbers that would not reconcile. The symptoms had presented and progressed in under 3 hours. Whatever had killed the technician had done so at a speed the medic's diagnostic equipment was not designed to process. Bayerink looked at the display readings and knew what he was looking at. "Get away from the body," he said. "All of you, now!" Orelin was in the doorway. Bayerink did not wait for questions. He pulled on a full containment suit from the emergency locker and moved to the diagnostic station at the far end of the bay. Standard procedure for unknown pathogen exposure. He had considered it only a theoretical possibility aboard Purity's gaze, until he heard the alarm and recognized whose body the medic was working on. He ran a rapid genomic sequence on the tissue samples the medic had already drawn. He ran it twice. The analysis took 11 minutes. Bayerink spent those 11 minutes reviewing the probe's decontamination log. The protocol had been followed exactly. Every step, every interval, every verification checkpoint. The technician had not made an error. The protocol had been written for the original cleanser variant, with decontamination parameters calibrated to the original surface protein architecture. The mutated strains altered surface proteins had passed through it undetected because the protocol had been designed to detect something that no longer existed. The protocol was not wrong. It was written for a weapon that no longer existed. The analysis completed. Bayerink read the results, set down his data slate, and read them again. A mutated variant of the cleanser, one of the new configurations he had been examining when the alarm sounded, had crossed the species barrier. The mutation had found a protein-folding vulnerability in macrophage biology, a structural configuration that his design work had neither identified nor needed to identify, because the work had been aimed entirely in the other direction. The result required a moment. 4 solar cycles, 847 failed iterations, and the 848th, which had held. He had been meticulous. He had built what he had been asked to build and built it well. The thing he had built had been reassembled into something he had not designed, and it was now aimed directly at him. The pathogen was macrophage-specific, lethal. The progression rate was faster than anything he had designed, significantly faster, because his work had been calibrated for reliability rather than speed. Whatever Earth's biosphere had made of the cleanser, it had not been slowed down. Orelin was still in the doorway. "Seal the ship," Bayerink said. Orelin looked at him for a long moment. Bayerink had worked alongside Orelin for 3 solar cycles and had never seen the commander's expression change. It changed now. Not dramatically, a depth of stillness that went beyond what he always carried. The joint lines at his jaw seemed to tighten in their faint, dark tracery. "Seal the ship," Bayerink said again. "No departures, no docking, nothing leaves." Orelin left to issue the order. Bayerink remained in the medical bay for a long time after that, alone with the results and the body and the silence that descends when there is nothing left to dispute. Several rotations later, the crew roster on the command center's secondary display had fewer names than the last time Bayerink checked. He had known before he looked. The corridors had been quiet for hours. The medic was gone. 3 of the 6 officers from the briefing, 2 of the engineering team. The progression rate was consistent across every case. Rapid onset, faster deterioration, nothing the ship's medical systems could meaningfully address. Macrophaged medical technology was designed for a world without endemic disease. It could treat injury. It could address catalogued conditions with care and efficiency. It had never been built for this, because this had not been a category of event, a world without plague needed to anticipate. Bayerink worked in the laboratory bench adjacent to the command center, attempting to synthesize a counter-agent. He had been at it for 30 hours. The problem was not the chemistry, the problem was the speed. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this high velocity. Macrophage research methodology was rigorous, iterative, designed to eliminate error through patient repetition. It produced excellent results. It produced them slowly. Bayerink had spent 4 solar cycles on the cleanser's original development cycle. He did not have 4 solar cycles now. "Prepare a full data package," Orelin said from the doorway. He was still standing, still modulated, still composed, though his skin had taken on the slightly dulled quality Bayerink had learned over the last 30 hours to recognize without remarking on. "Everything you know. I will send it to command with the ship's logs." Bayerink compiled the package. Orelin sent it. The response came within rotations. Quarantine protocols initiated at the homeworld, a salvage vessel dispatched, the nearest one available, 4 rotations from their position at maximum drive. Their own research facilities had been tasked immediately with counter-agent development, the full weight of macrophage scientific infrastructure directed at the problem. The homeworld scientists had responded within hours with a message addressed to Bayerink. They needed the mutated strain's full genomic sequence to proceed. Without it, they were working without data. The complete sequence existed in one place. Bayerink transmitted it. It was the correct action. He returned to his bench and held a clear thought about the fact that a salvage vessel 4 rotations out was not a solution to a pathogen with a 3-hour progression rate. The manifest updated again while he worked. And then, deep in the 31st cycle after deployment, Bayerink noticed a faint ache in the joints of his hands. The joint lines running across the backs of them, the faint dark seams he had carried his entire life without once thinking of them as anything other than the architecture of himself, had begun to feel like something other than nothing. A low, spreading warmth at the articulation points. Nothing that would show in his bearing, nothing visible to anyone watching him work. He had compiled symptom profiles across the last 30 hours. He knew the presentation. He knew the timeline. He knew with a certainty that had characterized every hour of his professional life what was beginning. There was no reason he should have been immune to what had taken the rest of the crew. He had been in the medical bay when the first case was processed. Before the suit, before the seals. His exposure, though, had been indirect, ambient, not direct contact. The progression would be slower. He had known this was coming. He had kept the knowledge in a separate compartment, the way a virologist learned to keep such knowledge, and it worked. He set the reaction vessel down. He picked it back up. There was nothing else to do. The alert had been chiming for 6 hours before Bayerink heard it. He had been at the laboratory bench, or on the floor beside it, or somewhere between those two states for most of those 6 hours. The ache in his joints had become something considerably more than an ache. He had developed a secondary symptom profile, deep, spreading fatigue, a visual flattening that he recognized as vascular, and had spent a period of uncertain length sitting against the base of the bench, working through the counter-agent calculations in his head because his hands had stopped cooperating with the physical work. The calculations were good. He was increasingly confident they were good. He had no mechanism to act on them. Orelin was on the bridge. Bayerink had checked on him 3 hours ago and found him in his command chair, barely conscious, his pale skin drawn tight across the joint lines of his face. Bayerink had returned to the laboratory. There was nothing he could do on the bridge, and the calculations were still incomplete. He eventually registered the alert. Low priority. Communications. It had been chiming at regular intervals, and he had been filtering it out without the automatic efficiency of a mind that had spent the last 30-plus hours triaging everything that was not the counteragent. He became aware of it the way he had become aware of the ache in his hands. Not suddenly, but as a fact that had always been present, arriving at the threshold of attention. There was nothing left to protect. He accepted it. Wide band, unencrypted, broadcast origin, the target world. Not a distress signal, not a weapons lock, not a communication in any format that his systems recognized as standard transmission protocol. An immense data package, a bandwidth commitment requiring deliberate resource allocation, structured in a format that his systems passed without difficulty, and which resolved on his display into a header he read once and then read again. Project Nightingale. cryptic pathogen X1 vaccine, and variant Z counteragent. Complete research record and synthesis protocols. Open distribution unrestricted. Variant Z. Bayer Inc. made it to the laboratory's comms console on the second attempt. The first attempt ended on the laboratory floor, and he spent a brief, unclear interval there before the part of him that had run 5 genomic sequence passes and rebuilt 3 models from a medical bay persuaded the rest of him back to vertical. He reached the comms console. He opened the files. Everything was there. The complete human research effort, structured in a format that appeared to be standard across their scientific institutions. Research logs including every failed approach, every discarded hypothesis, every dead end followed to its conclusion before being abandoned. Every failure was present, not dissolved, published. Data sharing architecture that allowed Bayer Inc. to see not just the final results, the entire path to it. Every team, every institution, every contribution, publicly attributed and openly indexed. He had never encountered anything structured this way. Macrophage research produced results. It did not produce this. Whatever this was. He traced the variant Z counteragent backward through the research record to understand how they had built it. They had sequenced the cleanser early, very early, within the first cycle of its deployment, which meant they had been sequencing novel pathogens at speed before they had any reason to expect one. He filed that. The sequence had returned a non-terrestrial genetic signature, the structural scaffolding of an engineered organism, distinct from anything in their biological record. They had understood immediately that they were looking at a weapon, that the weapon had been built by biological entities, that those entities, being biological, had a biology. And then they had done something that Bayer Inc., for all his years of rigorous, thorough, and award-nominated work, had simply never thought to do. They had read his weapon in reverse. The cleanser had been designed to bind to specific human receptor configurations. To do that work, its molecular architecture encoded those configurations, encoded the exact shape of what it was targeting, the way a key encodes the lock it was cut to open. His weapon carried, written into its own structure, a description of what it had been designed to destroy. The humans had read that description, had derived from the cleanser's binding mechanism sufficient information about the biology of its makers to model their relevant receptor profiles, had used that model to identify, before the variant Z mutation had reached a single macrophage, the very vulnerability the mutation would exploit. The protein folding calculations that mapped that vulnerability had been distributed across the civilian computing network. He had logged in his surveillance feeds and filed it without category. Personal machines, donated processing capacity, millions of them. They had found the crack in his species' biology. They had known before his crew did. They had built the counteragent as a precautionary measure, as though the possibility that a bioweapon might mutate and turn on its source was simply a contingency to be managed alongside the others, as though this was something a species planned for. Because they did. The lead researcher on the variant Z counteragent, F. Nachtigall. He had seen that name before. It took a moment to place. The coordination traffic, the global network feeds, the name attached to the PRIG that had appeared in his intercepts, while his mortality curve was developing its anomalous resilience. He had filed it and moved on. He had not moved far enough. The last entry in the researcher log was a single appended line. Unattributed, added after the synthesis protocols had been finalized and the package had been prepared for transmission. We assume this was an accident. Do not let it happen again. The vaccine worked. Bayer Inc. administered it at the laboratory bench and sat quietly while the vascular symptoms began to resolve. He cleaned the synthesis equipment and compiled the counteragent protocol for the homeworld's researchers. He went to the bridge. Orelin was dead. Bayer Inc. stood in the entrance for a longer moment than he had expected, then crossed to the secondary console and transmitted the full data package to the homeworld. The human research record, the synthesis protocol, the complete counteragent file, everything just as he had received it. His species would live. The salvage vessel was still 2 rotations out. He returned to his own station and opened the service observation feed. Earth was recovering. The infrastructure of the PRIG was still visible in the coordination data. The network of shared research, the quarantine support structures, the public health apparatus that had flattened his mortality curve and then turned its attention outward. The cleanser had not destroyed that infrastructure. The cleanser had activated it. Bayerink understood, sitting alone on the bridge of a ship crewed by the dead, that he had never been running a weapons program. He had been running a calibration exercise. The humans had not merely survived. They had transmitted everything they had, openly, unencrypted, unrestricted, without waiting to be asked. The message appended to the end of the package was not mercy. It was the thing you said to something you were not afraid of. The fear was not of the pathogen, not of dying, of being looked at by someone that had just demonstrated without raising their voice that they understood what he was and had chosen for reasons he could not determine to let him live. He did not know which was worse, that they might have been merciful or that they were not.